Rafat, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. It's our first episode of our geopolitical podcast. It's going on so much in the world these days. So, unfortunately, there's so much we have to focus on all the topics that are at hand. And these days, obviously, it's the war of Israel and the United States against Iran and everything that comes with it. So I was wondering, what do you make of the war objectives that are floating around? There are numerous of them, and we actually, after 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we do not still even know what they are really all about. What would you make of it?
First of all, thank you, Alex. This is obviously a new venture, both for you and I. Looking forward to how this progresses. And yes, we are here in interesting times. I think the question that you raised is really a very important one, because there is just so much confusion as to what is the purpose. Well, we understand what the stated purpose was, but what is the actual purpose? What's the end game? And within all of that, I was just speaking to somebody earlier today, our biggest issue is what is true? I mean, what is the reality? It's clear that there is propaganda, there are truths, half-truths, versions of facts that are being disseminated. But given that there is hardly anybody with a real presence on the ground as far as, let's say, mainstream media is concerned, it's very difficult to really understand what is going on.
Yeah, and you also, I guess, need the bigger picture. Even though the Gulf region is already big, we have had what went on in Venezuela. You have the threats towards Greenland and also Cuba, and especially with Greenland and Venezuela and Iran, we have natural resources playing into the field and into the game. So I wonder if we widen the horizon to what the Trump administration did in the last couple of months, if that gives us a better understanding of the real prerogatives of the war, the real reasoning and the real objectives.
My belief here is that no matter what you think of of President Trump and his agenda, the MAGA agenda, and the reasons for why he was elected, I think he's been pretty clear, and there is a clear pattern that's developing in terms of projecting American power, superpower, securing natural resources for the benefit of the United States. And in some respects, rolling back on what he and some of those that are close to him see as almost appeasement, that we let everyone take advantage. And I'm not trying to be an apologist here for President Trump, but in terms of taking advantage of the United States, our benign attitude towards the rest of the world. So China goes and gobbles up half of Africa through the various initiatives, including the Belt and Road. They've got access to all of the natural resources. The Russians are blessed with huge amounts of some of those same resources. Other countries are doing the same, but somehow we, the United States, have been left behind. And I think there can be no real doubt that accumulation or aggregation of certain natural resources, and particularly now things like the so-called rare earth metals, given the very important role they play in technology, both from the standpoint of your mobile phone all the way through to the cone head of a ballistic missile. That is something that those around the president have given a great deal of thought to, and that is an underlying fact in terms of what they're doing. Now, there are arguments at the same time that a lot of the action, particularly as it relates to sources of energy, is to do with China. We know that China imports about 70% of its energy needs. We know that a very substantial portion or percentage of that 70% came from Venezuela and Iran.
Yep.
And it came from there primarily because it was cheap. China has been able to buy very substantial amounts of, particularly both the Iranian crude oils and Venezuelan, at very substantial discounts to the true market price. And so whilst China's been the beneficiary of that, they bought effectively raw materials very, very cheaply, but been able to sell the finished goods at full price. and that is, that's exactly what has gone on. And part of what they're trying to do here is to reverse that again.
Why now? So this all makes sense what you say, and obviously the Trump administration, again, no apologism here, but like it's also a very oversimplified understanding of the work, because also America benefited a lot from the economic circumstances it created itself. But the question now is why now? Because this, China getting like discounted oil from Venezuela and from Iran, that's been going on for a while, and the opponents of this war also say like, yeah, you need to have a rational why now, because otherwise this war is sliding into illegality. Do you see anything going on in the world why it makes sense for America to strike now, America and Israel?
I think the why now is really very much determined by the occupant of the White House, that the politics that have come with with President Trump, support a far more aggressive United States, outward-looking United States than there has been for, let's say, ever since 1945. You might also argue, right, for the last 70 plus years. So I think the why now comes very much from there. There is also, one would argue that the world from the post-Second World War, post-Marshall Plan, post the Kennedy Camelot version of America, if you like, certainly one that I grew up with as a child, of what it meant to aspire to go to America, or what America was supposed to represent, has had its moment. It's come and gone. And whether you look at the United States, but you also look elsewhere within Western Europe itself, from countries like Holland, you look at Hungary, you can go to some parts of the former Balkan states, there is definitely a shift in terms of public opinion and what is deemed to be acceptable, and the level of aggression, if you like. The rollback, we see that in the rollback in relation to openness towards whether it's refugees, the rollback on some of the human rights treaties that were put in place in the aftermath of particularly the aftermath of the Second World War, refugee status, etc., etc., etc. There is, and in some, I would argue that really a lot of this goes back to 2008, 2009, the great global financial crisis, that whole wave of Clintonian easy money, good times are here, West Wing view of America came to an abrupt end. Okay, but really, of course, we know that 2001, the events of 9/11, but the Bush administrations and George W. Bush's administrations look like
indeed like
doves compared with the form that we had. And at the time, they were the neocons. Oh my God, what are they doing? And this war on terror, and the war on this, and the war on that. But it's an evolution, and the pendulum has swung another way. And yes, it's acceptable to say I want to be more aggressive about something.
But I feel Trump won partly because he said we will not be continuing to be interventionist. So I feel like that's exactly the opposite to what Bush was going into the war on terror. That was also supported highly. Like the Afghan war was supported highly, up to 90% of the US population at the time, whereas now for Iran there is no majority in sight. So you see clearly also in that regard something in America has shifted away from the trillions of spending in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they voted, and most of veterans voted for Trump, especially for that. And now he's reversing like this policy. So, and this is kind of like, this is why I'm asking why now, if there's like anything in particular, because Xi Jinping also has his timelines, regarding to Taiwan. Those two wanted to meet. Now this meeting is going to be postponed, and we do not know when this is going to happen finally. And maybe we also do not know this because the conflict could even like escalate in the region. If we talked about oil already, the commodities, but we also have to talk about water safety and security, the desalination facilities that have been attacked, oil fields that have been attacked. So how do you see the danger of all this spiraling out of control? Because we say like it's going to be maybe a world war, but then it's maybe first a very like hands-on, fully fledged regional war, because like from Bahrain to Saudi Arabia, like the existential needs of a society are under threat.
No, you're right, Alex. I think that there is much fear at the moment of the spiraling out of control. But part of me says, we were told in June last year that the vast majority of Iran's so-called nuclear capability had been destroyed. And along with that, there were obviously very heavy damage inflicted both by the United States and Israel on other military infrastructure. We've seen in the last 2 weeks that there's, frankly, little or no meaningful military response from the Iranian side, and what little there was has been destroyed. So what is there to cause a broadening of that, if you want, right? I mean, the Chinese are not going to intervene. They're far too sensible and have left this alone. Yes, you're right. What's been surprising and I guess an innovation, although it was signaled very broadly that they would do this, the Iranian firing of missiles and drones at their neighbors, at so-called countries that they see as having collaborated, whether it was firing those drones and missiles directly at air bases, or it seems increasingly now at perhaps not so obviously military targets, trying to suck one or more of those countries. And I think this morning, there were some statements out of Saudi Arabia, at least attributed to Saudi Arabia, which implied that the Saudis were getting, hang on, enough is enough. If you keep doing this, we're going to... Do they get suckered in? Hard to say.
Well, like how does this all make sense for this two allies, Israel and the United States? Because to me, it seems their war objectives, as little as we can say about them, are not. Also, they are diverging in a way, because Israel is also having campaigns in Gaza, the Gaza Strip, in Lebanon. So I wonder, like, if you can synchronize this even, or if this is like one reason for spiraling out of control, because one party wants something else than the other. Trump has already said, "Oh, the war is over. We achieved our objective," and Netanyahu is like not seeming to be that sure about that.
And again, I would agree with you that they may have had a common objective at the start, but the longer this goes on, the more uncomfortable one would imagine that President Trump certainly, and those who, as you said, were part of the MAGA coalition that voted him into power, will start to feel uncomfortable with what's going on. And on the flip side of this, you do have to wonder, what on earth are the long-term ambitions of Israel? You have done what you've done in Gaza. You're now doing, obviously, whatever you're doing in Iran. You're extending yourself very significantly. How long can you keep that up? This is, again, we've heard about the billions being spent or the cost of the war per day, but that applies as much to the Israelis as it does to the US. Obviously, in absolute terms, Israel is a smaller number, but in terms of its impact on the Israeli economy, it's obviously a big number. But where do they go from this? Where do they stop? And many people that I speak to ask the question, well, what are the Israelis thinking? Because you are stirring up the young children today who soon to be young adults, the young adults who soon to be young teenagers, soon to be young adults and grown men especially. The harm that's been done to them, whatever your justification for it, that is stirring up decades and decades worth of long-term hatred, presumably, towards those who perpetrated whatever has happened to them. And at some level, that's presumably going to be happening in Iran too, and Iran is a country of 90 million people. And say what you will, but there are, by all reasonable estimates, a good 20, 30 million of those people are very staunchly pro the current political setup that's there. So by killing, and don't forget, the American or the Israelis specifically, I guess, from what we understand, have just killed my Pope. If I'm a Shia Iranian, I may not be a great fan of the regime, but there's a point where killing my Pope, killing my spiritual leader, that really is a step that many would argue is a step too far. Now, I may not turn that into absolute hate and go and put on a suicide bomber jacket and take some action against Israel, but clearly you've lost a fan or a potential supporter. And I think these are the kind of questions that really are many that I know, not just in obviously in the UK or in Europe, but also in the Middle East itself, and even in Asia, where I spent a long time, are asking the question: what do they think they're doing? How are they going to contain the long-term fallout? You haven't even identified a potential replacement as an acceptable leader. Who is that going to be? There isn't a single opposition figure of any standing that the opposition can even begin to coalesce around. And it certainly isn't, with the deepest respect to him, the Shah's son. He's been out of the country for so long and an irrelevant figure by all accounts. So it can't be him. Who? And anyone, anyone who might have been viable, even by President Trump's own words, has been killed. So
by Israel, so then also America. So that's what I mean, like talk about divergent interests. So probably Israel killed some of the people that Trump wanted to be in power. But
that's the whole issue, that Israel longer term, what do you want from all of this, right? Where and how much are you going to keep your forces on this kind of level of alert? How much money are you going to spend? And it is difficult to understand.
Yeah, and
either this was a massive, great miscalculation that that the people are going to come out onto the streets, will bomb for 2-3 days, a week maximum, and then here are tens of millions of people on the streets, and a new leader will emerge. Well, we've seen that certainly hasn't happened, and
it's also a miscalculation that Trump.
If that was if that was the belief,
yeah.
It's like you and I were talking the other day. It's like it almost reminds, as I said, it reminds me of that old joke, which is when the Russians invaded Afghanistan. They back in 1979 gave many reasons for why they did that, and one of those was that they were invited in. And so the joke on the streets of 79, 1980 was, so when are the Russians leaving Afghanistan? And the answer was, when they find the person that invited them in. And so somewhat here you have that same issue, is that you came in many weeks too late to prevent the murder, the massacre of, if we believe the numbers that are out there, of 30, 40,000 civilian Iranians. That's what happened. And now what?
Yeah, and to circle back to actually that question, like you mentioned this, like Israel has made like steps towards like peace in the region, and now this is all in shambles. And then you have the diverging interest, let's say, between America and Israel. And I was wondering if that is connected to the Strait of Hormuz. Israel getting like it has its own natural gas or liquefied gas resources. It gets like oil from Nigeria and Central Asia, so maybe it has not the same need for the Strait of Hormuz to be open. And Donald Trump is scrambling for international support, which he does not get. Neither from East Asian allies nor from European or NATO allies. And China, of course, as you mentioned, would not just, that is what Trump did. Yes. Why would they help him out in this one? But I think this seems to be a culmination point where already like the interest seems to be diverging.
Agreed. And part of this, I think the issue that here is that where there is no clarity as to what is it that your objective is, and it's still not been made very clear, then it's very difficult, particularly some of the EU nations, I guess, and certainly for the East Asian nations who are just not interested in kind of participating in these kind of operations deep down, without some sort of justification. At least if you give them some sort of UN cover, well, you've totally destroyed the UN and its sort of relevance to all of this anyway, as far as the current administration, President Trump, is concerned. The UN is not even a word that mentioned. When was the last time you heard any official of any standing in the current administration mention the words United Nations? They haven't, right? So
they seem to be running out of money by July if the U.S. administration is not giving the money there.
There are all of those other factors, right? Yeah, but then there's no chance that the UN is going to come crawling on its knees. Because again, this is a topic maybe for another day. There are just so many things that are inherently wrong with the UN, the wastefulness, etc., etc.
That's an own episode for that. But I want to go back to one point that you raised earlier about the Shia Pope, because it seems to be like, again, wherever you stand on the side of any conflict, you should just be knowing the context and what's going on the ground. And we have seen in the Iraq War and in other Middle Eastern adventures of Western powers in that region that the lack of this knowledge has caused havoc. Is that the same thing we're seeing now, that there's the Kurds are in Iraq and Turkey and Iran?
I believe that. It's correct. It's that if you don't understand what drives the Shia sect of Islam, their if you like, their fervor, the way that Shia Islam obviously came into being following the death of
Ali,
that is very much fundamental to the core belief in terms of their willingness to, for example, in the month of Muharram, to walk along streets beating themselves until they bleed. You don't see that in very, very few other examples of religion around the world, where people are worked up and willing to commit themselves to that much pain in a cause that they believe in so much. That's not to say that Shia are, and they're absolutely not, violent people per se, but the sect came out of violence, and therefore their commitment, you would argue, to the faith, their spiritual leader, should not be underestimated. And whilst 300 years ago you might have found that the killing a pope would certainly had a few million Catholics up in arms, ready to murder and fight for the cause of Catholicism in that kind of way. Maybe you don't have that today, but I would say, and please don't take my words out of context, so that God forbid if there were someone who were to assassinate or to attempt to assassinate the Holy Father, there are still a few million Catholics out there for whom that would be just something they would feel that they would need to avenge and take revenge for. But Shia Islam, as I said, is based on comes out of its birth is from that of a violent event, and therefore fighting for that cause is very, very important.
And I guess also these mentalities and history and what shapes you. That does not necessarily mean you are hyper religious or pious. It's just like the same in Europe, as you just said. You have these parameters that are yours, and when they are attacked, it's like an attack on your identity. I was wondering, if you stay in the region, you have also expat, if you so will, Iranians in the Gulf. The Gulf states are now, in a sense, destabilized. You mentioned already, like attack on civil, airports, by rockets. So like all these. How do the Gulf states react to that, especially with the Iranian diaspora or minorities in there? What's your take on this?
I think that it's a difficult situation for them to face. But I would look at it slightly differently in the sense that for the longest period, Iranians were the single largest population outside of Emiratis within the UAE. And they are a wealthy community as well. Now, in the last decade, that has changed as far more South Asians, particularly Indians, they have overtaken the number of Iranians, particularly in Dubai. But you have very substantial families, wealth, commercial interests from the Iranian diaspora, some of whom are even obviously connected to the regime itself. So you first have to ask the question: just how much damage is the regime, or what's left of it, as we led to believe, would actually inflict upon infrastructure in which they may well own large parts of. But for the Gulf states themselves, it's a very difficult situation because at some level, of course, there's a Sunni-Shia divide for starters, but retaliating, getting into a ding-dong with what is left in Tehran, do they really want to be in a long-term war? They've built themselves as havens of stability, both in terms of politics, social, and very importantly, financial. And so far, I think most people have been pretty pragmatic in terms of what that means from a financial perspective. If you've moved assets there over the last couple of decades, you're not about to take them out overnight. Let's face it. No bank is under threat. There's no run on the banks. There isn't any real financial implication for the UAE in particular, but also for Qatar as well, taking two of the more wealthier states. And then those that have moved there for, whether it's to get away from Europe and to get away for looking for new opportunity. If you've just moved there, again, in the last 4 or 5 years, yes, you didn't sign up for shrapnel and drones falling on you, but hopefully this is something that's temporary, and it's not just so easy to take your children out of school, move back, go and buy a house. So these are situations that people are going to have to learn to deal with. I mean, I lived through the first Gulf War. I was based in Saudi Arabia, working at an American bank at the time. And yes, I remember very different era, of course. There we, obviously the first night was January 16th, 1991. The air raid sirens went off, and then we were told the Scud missiles were coming. CNN had just sort of begun to get a bit of a global footprint. And in the end, it turned out the Patriot missiles were far superior to what the Scuds were. And from the second day onwards, we were stepping outside. When the air raid sirens would go off, rather than go and crawl under the stairs, we'd watch the fireworks, the Patriots taking out the Scuds. It was an incredible display. Today, clearly, there's a different level of danger. You're not having outdated Scud missiles, but you've got clearly very sophisticated small drones, which can... they can go and target a leader in some way. If they can find someone sleeping in their bedroom without doing damage to the rest of the building, it's a very, very different, very scarier proposition.
And if I might challenge your view as the last question of this episode, this first episode here, is kind of like, we see attacks on the drinking water facilities in the region. And I think what you said about schools and children, I think this makes all sense. But the moment Riyadh has no drinking water, the city needs to be evacuated like in a week. So I think we have indeed looking at that also a new quality or non-quality. There are also some asking that the UN, which they will not do it at this point because America is not in it, just have to repel these sort of attacks on water facilities legally. But what do you make of this? There's an escalation chance. There could be Riyadh being empty. So that's not a good prospect at the end of this episode.
I think the chances of Riyadh being empty are very, very small. I mean, the Saudi government is more than capable. It's in a very different position today from what it might have been in 1991. Again, the way the first Gulf War was fought. Much greater sophistication, much greater local participation in the military armed forces, just much greater financial resources being committed to that. And I just don't see that happening. And I think the leadership there would do everything it can to prevent such a situation happening. But you're right. It's how the escalation from military targets into more civilian targets, which is really what you're talking about, comes down to how long the Iranian regime is able to hold out, how long they continue to be able to arm themselves. As you're saying, going back to the start of this, one of the first things I said was, we don't know what the truth is. Do they have a week's supply of drones and missiles, or do they have a year's worth of supply? We have nobody knows, and at least most outside of the inner sanctum of the workings, and both in America and Iran would know. It all depends. As that stockpile gets depleted, the desperation level of then taking out, as you said, desalination plants, taking out more in civilian, really bombing airports, really going after seaports. And yes, what we don't even, whilst we've heard reports that the Iranian Navy has been decimated, do they have no capability left of laying mines into the Straits of Hormuz? It's how... again, it's a question for how long could they put in a couple hundred mines, so many mines that it's going to take years to end up trying to remove those from there. So this is something that we have to really see evolve. We're not a month into this exercise just yet.
Thank you so much, Rafat, for this first episode. I'm sure we will be continuing talking about Iran and what's happening in the region around the Gulf. And that was a very insightful conversation, and I thank you for this.
Alex, thank you very much. I look forward to getting together again soon.